Professor Mavrikos, good morning. Good morning to all of you. It is a great honor for us to have you in this summer school program. You are a very well-known professor with experience in political science and European studies, and you are a professor in the ACT in Thessaloniki. We are ready to follow your contribution, and we are keen to work with you today. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to be speaking about the Mediterranean Sea and how it both unites and divides, with a particular focus on irregular migration. I'm going to start off with a PowerPoint presentation just to share some ideas with you and to sort of provoke you to be thinking about the Mediterranean Sea in different ways, both politically, historically, geographically. And then once we get through our slides and our look at the Mediterranean Sea and its complexity and uniqueness, I'm going to ask the participants of the workshop to involve themselves in an activity, to place themselves as if they were policymakers, to try to create and carve out a comprehensive migration policy. So let me begin. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers and to the city of Kavala for this beautiful building to which we find ourselves in. And the sun is out, the storm has gone, and we find ourselves in a much better situation today than we have the past days in terms of weather-wise. Greece has experienced horrendous weather phenomena. Okay, so when you think about the Mediterranean, what comes to mind? Lots of people, when they say, where do you work, Tina, now? I said, oh, yeah, I work in the Southern Europe. I work in Greece. And they say the Mediterranean. And there's a kind of dynamic image that has been created about the Mediterranean. Lots of myths and histories about the Mediterranean. When we think about food, right? You think about cuisine, there's something called the Mediterranean diet, which has become actually very popular, eating fruits and vegetables and yogurts and all kinds of things that are healthy for you. And this has become actually very popular. And in a way, it has created a notion, an idea that somehow or another eating healthy, eating fresh foods and vegetables is something that younger generations are much more keen to be aware of than those in the past. But when we think about this Mediterranean, we also think about it sort of as a sea of cultures and an immense cultural diversity, whether we look at art or we look at music influences, whether we look at philosophy, whether we look at literature, when we think about theater, mathematics. There have been so many different contributions over the centuries of different peoples that surround the Mediterranean, and interchange and interconnections between those peoples that have affected cultures and societies and populations throughout the centuries. But the Mediterranean is also and has been a place of conquest. So when we think about politically the ambitions of states and empires, whether we're talking about the Persians or in ancient times the Greeks and the Romans, the Romans had a famous description of the Mediterranean Sea. They called it Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. So the idea that there was something special and unique about the Mediterranean goes back to ancient times. So there's a long history of looking at the way the Mediterranean has been created as an image and as a notion and an idea that kind of transcends the physical space. But when you think of the Mediterranean, and if you go outside of the Mediterranean area, people see this area as a destination for a vacation. So I've just got these very small little YouTube things. You go to Aegean Airlines, and just check out the imagery in this video. Okay, so what were some of the key words that were associated with the various destination places? Do you remember any of them? It came kind of quickly.
Fun.
Fun. Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is a fun place. Okay, lots of adventures. Remember?
Rejuvenation.
Rejuvenation. Okay, so you come here to get rejuvenated, to charge up your batteries. Freedom. Why do you think they included that one? Go ahead. What does freedom mean? Okay, so having lots of choices, right? The ability to make a decision and to be able to fulfill that decision. Okay, so free to choose, right? Free to do lots of things, maybe, right? Free to be able to explore stuff, right? Remember another one? Serenity. Yeah, what was that? What does that mean? Why would that be on a travel destination advertisement? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so away from things, right? To be able to just daydream, maybe, right? Look at the sea, or stand on the top of a cliff and just feel free, right? Feel that you can explore and you're at peace.
All these are positive feelings.
Yes, good.
This is what you said here.
Yes,
Feeling.
your
We're
neck
talking
feeling.
about feeling.
Yes, that's right. So it's evoking emotion. And this kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. When we think about the Mediterranean, we think about it as this kind of a destination where this sort of positive vibe comes through. And this is not just, by the way, Aegean. Just to be fair, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint in a second, and I'm going to show you just one more of these. Whoops. Hold on. Let me get back to that slide again. So let's make a little comparison. The tourism person can tell us about this more, huh? So this one's about Egypt. All right. So what was being promoted here in this advertisement of Egypt?
Mostly the history.
Okay, yeah, a lot of emphasis. Okay, culture, history.
Yes, culture, the nature of it.
Okay,
What I noticed was the colors, the
Right, okay.
natural colors,
Right.
relaxing colors.
Right, and this is targeted for a specific tourist population too, huh? Yeah, right? More intellectual, middle-aged people, huh? Who want to not just have a vacation to have fun, but to learn and see something, right? But this also gives you another kind of idea about, you know, how this area is promoted to the world, right? And what kinds of people are being targeted, right? For these kinds of promotions. So when we think about the Mediterranean, lots of people think about the Mediterranean. They think about it as it's a kind of an exotic place to visit. Okay, whether it's just to enjoy the waters, the lakes, and the sea, but also to learn something about the history. So there's something, again, exotic, right, about this geographical neighborhood, and that is definitely used as a promotion for also tourism. So we do think of the Mediterranean also as a vacation destination, okay, as a place to go, to explore, and to wander through. Now, when we think about the Mediterranean, though, and so here we're looking at it. I can't stand up, right? Okay, I forgot the microphone here. Okay, this is my teacher thing coming out. Okay, so when we think about the Mediterranean Sea, okay, this is connecting 3 different continents, okay, Africa, Europe, and Asia. There are 22 countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes we use very specific regional descriptors. Okay, so this is sort of the North African coast, or we could use this area as the Eastern Mediterranean. We use this area here below Italy and surrounding Sicily and Malta sort of as the central corridor, and certainly around Spain and the Strait of Gibraltar and this tip, we use this as the Western Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is also subdivided into different, more local regional spaces. Okay, and that sometimes has significance. It has significance for international organizations because they'll say, you know, passage and movements in the southern Mediterranean or what's going on in the Central Passage. So, for instance, the Organization for International Migration kind of uses these sub-regional demarcations for its description of movements of people. So it has actually significance for also the ways by which we locate the 22 countries that surround the Mediterranean and the 3 continents that it actually connects. And then there's just one other kind of interesting thing to say is that there are also little seas in here, okay, surrounding, right, the various countries and regions. And of course, for us here in Greece, the Aegean is a real focal point for movements of people coming from the east, whether that's initially, their last destination before arriving into the waters of the Aegean is usually Turkey, but not always. Okay, so there are ways to sort of look at the Mediterranean also in terms of its geographical space. And that's kind of important to keep in mind as well. There's a great book I have my students read in an introduction to international relations by Tim Marshall. Has anybody read any of Tim Marshall's books? Okay. He's a funky journalist who's traveled all around the world. And his first book was called Prisoners of Geography. And in this book, he really maps out how geography is fait accompli, basically, for understanding the politics of a country and the real importance that geography has for a country. It's something a country doesn't pick. You don't pick where you are in the world. It's something that is what it is. But how is that so defining in terms of your politics and in terms of your relationships with your neighbors, whether you live in a conflictual region or not, has so much relevance for the politics. His most recent book, The 10 Maps, Explain Global Politics is also interesting. And in that most recent book of his, he does have Greece and Turkey. I have my kids in my class read those two chapters first, and we kind of juxtaposition those two. But interestingly enough, and maybe with foresight, he also has regions like the Sahel in Africa. And I'm sure when he was writing this, he wasn't thinking that the Sahel was going to be such an important region right after this book actually came out with the most recent military coup taking place in Gabon. So the Sahel region has fallen into a non-democratic, unfortunately, situation, which I don't think anybody really saw coming. But Tim Marshall does mention the precariousness of political stability in that region. So in some ways, he had real foresight. I had my students read this chapter about 2 weeks before the conflict in Sudan happened. And they said, oh my gosh. The first thing the students ran into the classroom and said, wow, that was so helpful to know about the importance of this region, and particularly the theory of neo-colonialism and its repercussions. All right, so geography is real and key and important. So let's try to think about this more sort of logistically. What ways does the sea unite? Okay, so we've said some of these already, geographically, right, physically, right, looking at those 3 continents and the 22 countries that surround that. So there is a geographical, geopolitical aspect to it. Trade and commerce is another big way. So for people in business here, we know that trade and commerce is immense, and I'm going to show you another slide of just the trading routes and patterns that happen in the Mediterranean Sea. This cultural exchange we talked about, crossing of religions and philosophies and populations, and this dynamic image of the Mediterranean created through myths and history, and as we even saw, advertising and tourism and vacation destinations. But this is a pretty wild slide. Okay, when I first saw this is actually a snapshot of the ship traffic that happens in the Mediterranean. Okay, this got cut off a little bit at the top here, but the yellow container ships, the orangey colors are tankers, the gray with the yellow are cargo ships, and so forth. Passenger ships, military, tugboats, fishing ships, sailing ships, ferries. Wow, there is a lot going on. And a lot of movements, okay, up and down, and actually, the interesting thing I thought about this is that there's a lot of movement east-west, but also sort of north-south inside the seas, which I don't know, when I was first looking at this, that was something that kind of came to my attention. I hadn't thought about that there was not only patterns that were running around here, but patterns that were also running up and down here. And around islands, particularly. Look what's going on. Whoa, look what's going on around Greece.
Yellow, you said this?
The yellow are and cargoes. Yeah, there's a little at the very top, but it's got cut off a little bit here because of when I stuck this on the slide a little bit. But isn't that amazing? If you just Google a Mediterranean ship traffic, they'll give you the snapshot of what's going on at that very minute. It's kind of like a little satellite that they have. This is like the War College that gives you like up-to-date information about where military troops are stationed at any one moment. So this is just like a little snapshot of that moment that I actually captured this to put it on this slide. But isn't that amazing? So yeah, what definitely unites and connects is this movement of all of these seafaring vessels of various types. So that's another thing that I guess we need to take into consideration, that there is a lot of movement of peoples and things that happen in the Mediterranean. So it is so important and strategic, economically speaking, for our populations. But we also know that the Mediterranean divides. So just as many things that we can find and say that unite, we can find and see that they divide. So regional and micro-regional differences. And these can be based on ecological differences. So I'm just talking about climate, terrain, territory, whether it's the desert, whether it's the sea, whether it's the lake, whether it's green pastures. What about the terrain? What about the ecological differentiation? Okay, we're also talking about 3 continents, right, which are also different geographically and in terms of their terrain. So climatic differences, ecological differences, differences in terrain. And again, how we subdivide the Mediterranean, I showed you down the previous map, southern Mediterranean, eastern, central corridor, western. But the Mediterranean, the states in the Mediterranean also really diverge in terms of size, in terms of character, in terms of internal coherence, in terms of political regime type, in terms of their affiliation with international organizations. So the 27 countries of the European Union finding themselves partially, okay, those are again on our southern flank. For a very long time period, Greece was the southeastern country in the European Union, having joined in 1981. It wasn't until way later that Cyprus and Malta also joined the European Union. Okay, Spain and Portugal were sooner in 1986 after their dictatorships fell and democracy was restored in those countries. But we here in the Mediterranean are sort of the southern flank of the European Union. Okay, most of those members also are, many of those members are also NATO members. So international affiliations or membership in international organizations also very much sort of creates a divide between the countries. So there is a lot of difference. And of course there's religious difference, linguistically. Also, we see lots of divergent religions and languages spoken in the Mediterranean. So there are also lots of things that divide. Another really big division is between what I call the haves and the have-nots. That is, if we look at economic development, so economically speaking, okay, for our business students here, if you look at economic indicators, okay, some of which can be measured by gross domestic product, or the United Nations uses HDI, the Human Development Index, which takes into consideration all kinds of characteristics, also social and economic, whether there are educational systems, whether there are healthcare systems, and what kinds of provisions does a state provide its citizens, and it ranks those on a series of indicators. So when we think about economic development, we see a huge divergence. So when we're talking about developed and developing world, we see lots of differences. And a real big point of controversy is over migration governments. What countries in the Mediterranean get together and try to provide a more comprehensive migration policy that's not simply reactive, that is reacting to calamities and disasters and quote-unquote crises. The biggest word and by politicians in 2016 with the massive movement of people from Syria through Greece up to the northern parts of Europe was, this is a crisis. So why is it that only in crisis mode we come up with policies? What happens to do something proactively? That is, wait a minute, let's not wait for another quote-unquote crisis to happen. What do we do now? What are the ways that the countries of Southern Europe around the Mediterranean basin can create a kind of a much more comprehensive, taking into consideration lots of things that need to be economic, social, political, So a political space has actually been created between wanted and unwanted mobility. That is when countries actually more openly and willingly accept people to come into the country and when not. And there's a real big division, and that became real verified during the Ukraine-Russia war, when all of a sudden the European Union was able to record time to accept Ukrainian asylum seekers and migrants and make special accommodations for them. It was actually a policy that was already on the books in the European Union, but they had never really mobilized it. And all of a sudden, they got that in place. How is it that they were able to so quickly respond to that? And it took a very, very long time and pretty club-footed attempts to try to create migration policy back in 2016. So there's been a real big discussion that has opened up in Europe. But we'll see that Europe does not speak with one voice. Unfortunately, 27 countries have real different ideas, positions, policies, and perspectives about migration. And despite the fact that there is a migration commissioner, and despite the fact that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, tries to speak as if she was speaking on behalf of the European Union, as president of the Commission, we know that this is a very, very difficult policy to create. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the two recent attempts to create a more comprehensive migration policy, neither of which are really comprehensive. So, when we focus on migration and human mobility, there are lots of places to look at for statistics. I don't want to bombard you with statistics, but I do want to open this link by IOM. IOM has a pretty big office in Thessaloniki, and I've been in touch with them, and we've spoken about the ways by which international organizations have had to deal with irregular migration patterns into Greece. They work really closely with an NGO called ARSIS. ARSIS, A-R-I-S. I'm looking for... Oh, yeah. Classroom reaction. I'm looking for the board to write on. ARSIS, yeah, it's a non-governmental organization that primarily deals with unaccompanied minors. Thessaloniki at some point received 650 irregular migrants who were underage. At the beginning, they thought they were all boys because mostly unaccompanied minors, that means children under the age of 18, were mostly boys. And they were mostly sent to actually escape ISIS being recruited. But as they turned out on the bus, they were also girls, and so they had to make special accommodations also for some of the girls, and unfortunately they needed psychological assistance too, because many of them had been victims of sexual assault and rape on their trip. So those were closely with irregular migration, and they try to assist those that are finding themselves in different categories. So IOM is a kind of a good source to look at if you're interested in migration. I'm just going to open up this quickly. These are the most recent figures I found just from August. So this is just a little bit like of a shopping list to give you an idea of the magnitude. When we're talking globally, we're talking about 281 million people who are estimated to be international migrants. That means left their country, the physical borders of their country. There's a lot of people who are IDPs. That means internally displaced people. Internally displaced people are hometown but have not left the country. They don't fall into the same international category. This is a real problem because lots of people left Aleppo and went to other places. They couldn't, and they didn't qualify for refugee status. They couldn't seek asylum because they were still within the physical borders of their territory. So international migrants are people who have actually gone over the physical border of their country. Okay? born in another country and or held foreign citizenship. An estimated 13% of the total number of international migrants in 2020 were children below the age of 18. So, for instance, the Syrian population of the refugee relocation camps that I went to, about a third were kids. I will never forget the first time I went to Langadikya, here outside of Thessaloniki, actually between us in a way, between Kavala and Thessaloniki. It was a refugee camp of about 1,600 people, and there were 500 kids, 500 children at that camp. And it was so interesting the day I met the UNHCR representative. I went to the door, you know, and I had my my laptop and my notebook and pencils or whatever, and the kids were there to come, and they thought I was the teacher. So I went to the entrance of the door, like 100 kids surrounding me, and I said to the UNHCR rep, I said, "Why are all these kids surrounding me?" And she said, you know what? We were waiting for a teacher to come, and she says, they think you're the teacher. I was like, oh my. I said, well, I am a teacher. I'm not their teacher. She said, well, do you think you could do something with them? Just one activity? So, okay, these were children aged from like 5 to 18. So I said, one activity for all these kids. And so I had like a notepad, and it maybe had like, I don't know, 50 sheets. How many are on that notepad thing that you get and you pull out, you pull out the sheets. So I pulled out the sheets, I cut them in half. Everybody ran to find a pencil or a pen, and I taught them the alphabet. I didn't know what else to do. I taught them the American alphabet, and they were so thrilled. I cannot tell you. So that was a real interesting experience for me as an educator, but I had no idea that there were going to be over 500 children in that camp. So a large percentage and a growing number of international migrants are kids, okay? An estimated 169 million international migrants and so forth. Lots of interesting statistics here. I guess at some point I can share this with everybody. I don't know how we can do that, but we'll find a way. I'll send it to one of the organizers and you can share it with everybody else. Female migrants, okay, a growing number. Look at this, 48% of the total number of international migrants at a mid-year were girls and women. So a very large percentage and so forth, okay? It's got interesting information, this page. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So let's just get some definitions of what we're talking about. When we're talking about irregular or undocumented migration, okay? The EU Commission's definition of irregular migration, movement of persons to new places of residence or transit that take place outside the regulatory norms of the sending, transit, and receiving country. That means people move without having a visa. People move without having official legal documentation to enter. Okay, the UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees, movement of persons that takes place outside the laws, regulations, or international agreements governing the entry into or exit from the state of origin, transit, or destination. Okay, so that's a little bit more of an international legal kind of an explanation, obviously, because they're an international organization. Okay, just one thing about this term illegal that I talked about before, that people can't really be illegal, okay? And why undocumented or irregular migration is a much better way to describe them. Why not illegal? Well, for three big reasons. It's inaccurate, it's harmful, and it's against European values. Why to use that term? And I guess the most malevolent of all is this illegal alien description that the United States has been keen to use when talking about restricting movements of people. So it's legally incorrect, okay? To say somebody is illegal, it means they've committed a crime or something that constitutes a crime, so it immediately creates a derogatory and an idea that these people are doing something that's criminal. It's misleading. It ignores international legal obligations. It violates principles of due process, and so forth. So there's a whole lot of good reasons why the term illegal should not be used. And then more humanitarian things, like it's dehumanizing and criminalizing, it prevents fair debate, and so forth. So I just put this in here too as a link, because I think it's interesting and important for us to use the right terminology, or explain why the media or politicians use that terminology, because it immediately evokes something that seems to be criminal or unwanted. Okay. So, what do we mean by forced migration? And we're hearing this probably in the news. Okay, again, the European Commission has a definition: a migratory movement in which an element of coercion exists, including threats to life and to livelihood, whether rising from natural or man-made causes. That means that you don't want to go, but you got to go, basically. Okay, and there are lots of things in migration studies that we call push factors. Okay, so push factors could be war, could be economic duress, it could be famine, it could be floods, it could be lots of other things that push people out, that force people to leave unwillingly. That's migration. You leave your home not because you want to, not because you want to find a better job, or you're seeking out something. You have no choice. Your house has been destroyed, you're being bombed, you've been flooded out, or something has forced you to leave. Okay, so those push factors are involved in what we call forced migration. Okay, and we also know that this has dire consequences for people. When people leave because they're forced to, because they're desperate, because they don't have a choice, they will find any means to do so. And as a result, they succumb to what we know as the smuggling ring. So you're paying somebody to get you out because you feel you have no choice. And as the result, we see a tremendous amount of fatalities. This year alone, just 2023, and we're not done with 2023, more than 2,000 people are estimated to have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. 650 died just in a single boat sinking off the coast of Greece in June, if you remember what happened in terms of that disastrous R&R, rescue and recovery operation. Okay, the IOM also has a matrix, which is a little spooky, but they try to keep track of people lost at sea. Okay, they do this partially because they're trying to find, if they find them, a way to connect them with a family member or somebody else. There is a person at the morgue in Greece that actually is trying to create identity markers to allow the identification of those people who are found. And mostly they wash up at sea somewhere on some coast to create connections. So the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has a matrix, and I have that here as a hyperlink, but I won't open that. So we know that migration governance is going to involve lots of actors, multiple actors at different levels. Okay, so there are states involved, there are international organizations involved, there are business firms, companies, there are rescue operations, people who are doing volunteer work. There are lots of interconnection between these. Sometimes all of these create a cacophony. That is, they have different objectives, they have different outlooks, they have different perspectives. And then we see what kinds of laws and policies. Many of those are fragmented and they change quite often, depending upon the circumstances. Again, it's not a proactive policy, it's much more reactive policy. And then there are all these narratives, depending upon the point of view. So, when we think about some of these actors, and let's try to group them into kinds of categories. The global north. These are the states that are taking measures to tighten migration control in order to maintain control over southern borders. What's their story? Hey, we have to be able to control who comes in and out of our country for national security. We are the legitimate authority involved in our and we have the authority to make those decisions. So migration becomes associated with questions of national security and with sovereignty. The international level, we see dominant idea, yeah, okay, but we have to get together, right? Migration cannot be solved by any one country. It's totally impossible because it's a global issue. It's just like climate change that we heard yesterday, right? Professor Tsandi talked about water, right? Water is something that can't be solved by one state alone, right? It needs multilateral cooperation. It needs people to get onto the same page. In June of 2023, there wasn't another attempt to do that by the European Union. The Asylum Procedure Regulation, fancy name for APR, established this common procedure across the EU that member states need to follow when people seek international protection. It kind of piggybacks onto the common European asylum system that had been developed years before, but it doesn't really make decisive changes to the CEAS, the Common European Asylum System. It adds on to some specific legal matters. The other one is the new solidarity mechanism, and this was actually even more controversial in a way because supposedly it's going to help states that receive the most irregular migrants with financial contributions. So Greece and Spain and Italy that gets more migrants, okay, give them more money. So people at the table said, what? You're just throwing more money at this issue? And then people said, well, this is like buying cattle. Okay, we'll give you 2,000 euros for every migrant that you take in. Okay, demoralizing for the international migrants, and also the idea is you just can't throw money at the problem and think somehow or another it's going to fix it. Okay. The big omission is R&R. Okay, and that's not rest and relaxation, by the way. It's rescue and recovery when we talk about migration policies, which has largely fallen onto local coast guards, Frontex, NGOs, and other civil society actors. So the big daunting question for those people, and I went on a Frontex ship. I went out into the sea when I was in Lesbos. I talked to these NGO operators and assistants and volunteers, and the biggest problem is we work sometimes at odds with each other, although they try to work in unison. There's no overarching rescue and recovery operation at a European level. It's left to each nation state, basically. And although Frontex does coordinate with the Greek Coast Guard and the other Coast Guards, it's sometimes anybody's guess who is actually responsible. So Greece says Turkey's responsible when they come into international waters, but if you look at the distance between Lesbos and the Turkish coast, okay, or an island like Chios, 7 kilometers. Okay, whose water are you in now? Are you in Greek waters? So this ship is here. Are you in Turkish waters? So you're responsible for R&R. So that's why it's very club-footed. It takes a long time for coordination to happen. There's no central real way to coordinate rescue and recovery. And again, it's reactive. There's nothing sort of proactive in this process. So let's group it into 3 categories: problem drivers, results, and what do you do about it? Okay, so if the problem drivers are what's behind that, we have socioeconomic, structural conditions in the countries of origin. We've got this political instability, war, climate crisis, and instability, lack of democracy. Okay, we're seeing more and more countries fall to non-democratic regime types. Okay, again, the Sahel, great case in points. Okay, those people are going to be on the move, right? There's no doubt about it, that a portion of those people. Okay, look what happened in Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal. Those people were trying to get out. Okay, what happened in Pakistan? Big flood, trying to get out. So we're not going to see a stopping of irregular migration. In fact, my prediction is it's going to get more and more and more. So if we don't do something about it in terms of creating a comprehensive policy, then I think this will become a major issue. So mixed and massive irregular migration and forced migration flows. So what do we do? Throw up in hands in disbelief? So, if we say we have three sets of actors, we've got states, we've got international organizations, we've got NGOs, and civil societies. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is to role play. I'll divide you up into three groups, and I'm going to ask you to brainstorm as if you were from that organization or NGO or state. What comprehensive idea or ideas can you create? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start.